Hello, everyone. Welcome. I just drank a carbonated beverage, so hopefully we can turn the mic down just a scotch. You'll hear me mouth breathing. All right, welcome to this talk. My name is Joyce Lin. I'm the head of developer relations for Postman. Postman is an API platform used by 20 million people around the world. This conference is positively littered with people that work at Postman, attending, giving talks. So hopefully you have a chance to stop by the Postman booth. Most developers are familiar with using Postman throughout the consumer lifecycle, and most teams are familiar with the producer API lifecycle. So for folks in this room, you may know that you can define and design an API by authoring an API specification, like OpenAPI, and then use that specification to generate tests and documentation, and then deploy, observe, yada, 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 the rest of the producer lifecycle. The elusive producer lifecycle. Okay. So the title of this session is The Trials and Tribulations of Going API First. So it's a little bit juicy. We'll be taking a look at the Postman State of the API survey that was just posted earlier this month, surveyed 37,000 respondents and asked them what did they think about API First. And then, this is probably the part that you came for, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into 4 case studies. These are not real logos, so don't worry about trying to figure out who they are. They're very, very shy. So their identities have been protected because they have provided the raw, unfiltered experience under FriendDA. Okay, so this has not been approved by their teams. Don't worry, if you think you know who they are, you don't. Actually, you might, but pretend like you don't. We're gonna hear about their API first journey, their struggles along the way, and where they're headed next. Okay, so we will hit a brief overview of API first according to the State of the API report, and then we'll dive into the anonymous case studies, talking about the juicy bits, and then in the tail end, we'll talk about some lessons learned, commonalities among all the different scenarios, and recommendations for paving your own API first journey. So let's start with a brief overview of what, who, how, when, where. What does API first mean to you? Survey said a lot of different responses. Some people said API first is defining and designing APIs, schema-driven, design-driven development. Some say developing the actual API before the resulting apps and integrations. And then less people said defining the business requirements before designing and defining APIs. And actually, a lot of people who work with APIs aren't sure what API first means. But the most popular definition here is the schema-driven design first API development. It's the most common definition, especially among people who self-identify as API first leaders. Okay? So if we take this definition to be the agreed upon definition, design first, schema driven, how many people in the room today identify as an API first organization? Can you raise your hand, please? Okay, so I see about 50% of hands here. That's pretty good. Does anybody else not agree with that definition, but still say, hey, yeah, I'm API first? Oh, shy. Not a single person raised their hand. Okay, so if design first is the most common definition, especially among people who identify as API first leaders, what are the most popular schema types? Okay, so for this graph, you're looking at all the blue aggregate. So the blue bar and how far it extends to the left is going to be bigger market share. So JSON schema is going to be your most popular schema for data format. But when we're talking about API specifications, and for the last 3 years in a row, the answers have been kind of the same. The numbers have shifted, but the trends are the same. OpenAPI v2, aka Swagger 2, has the largest market share, but it's declining. Shoot, I hope that comes back, because I don't have any. I'm just reading the graph. And then OpenAPI v3 has the fastest growth rate. So year over year, the last 3 years, it's been kind of the same, but we can see the trends continuing. So for the teams who are using API specifications, why do they? Lots of reasons. Onboarding faster, spending less time, more productive. The R happier. If you're in San Francisco, you've seen our billboards. API-first companies have happier developers. So at least 75% of all the people surveyed thought that developers at API-first companies are happier, more productive, faster. A lot of these actually boil down to faster, saves me time. That's the bulk majority of why people go API first. Okay. Oh, already time for the dirt. Okay, so the young people call this spilling the tea. This is the juicy part. So let's start with, we have 4 companies. Let's start with the first one. The first one we'll call Code First. They have 8,000 headcount. They build APIs first. They're a developer-led company, but they start with a prototype since it's the first part of the developer experience. So that's Code First. Here's a little testimonial from them. We build APIs first because it's the first part of the developer experience. Start with a prototype, and then we back into the specification to align business and engineering. Okay, so I'm going to call them Code First, aka prototype. Next, we have API Last, 30,000 headcount, so many APIs, and they add on an API after core functionality is launched. And yet they have 100% adoption with using Open API to design their APIs. I'm still calling them API Last. Okay. So here's a testimonial. Leadership didn't have awareness of APIs as products, how many APIs we had, and our dependency on APIs. So leadership doesn't understand why APIs are important. But again, they have 100% adoption of Open API. Okay, the third company I'm going to call Developer First. So they're also 8,000 headcount, and they have a strong writing culture. So they propose APIs using a written design document. So lots of writing culture. They propose changes in this design document and then circulate them for threaded discussions. That's Developer First. And the last one we have is Early Days. So this is 1,000 headcount employees, and they design and build, oops, I shouldn't stand there. They design and build the happy path first, API first. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of support for API first, but we're not quite there yet. We're in a phase where teams are not fulfilling the recommended workflows. So I started off interviewing these 4 companies thinking, okay, let me just take all the commonalities and kind of aggregate them and share them with the crowd. But these four companies ended up being very, very different. They're on different paths to API first. So these are the 4 anonymous organizations. All of them have millions of users. All of them are real. And so the first question I asked them is, do you identify as an API-first organization? 50% of the people in this room do identify. What about these 4 orgs? Okay. So Code First. This is the developer-led organization. They say, no, we don't identify as API first. We build the API first, but then we use Open API as a contract to align business and engineering. API Last says, heck no, we're not API first. We're design first. And it took us 4 years to get to 100% adoption. Oh no, with a custom variation of Open API. There's a clue there. Okay, developer first, no, but we're not API first, we're developer first. So APIs are a strong part of our culture. We know they're important, but we use a written document, and then we use Open API because it really gives us the speed to automatically generate a bunch of stuff like collections, mock servers, SDKs, documentation. And then we have Early Days. Yes, we're API first. We design and develop APIs first, but so far only 50% of our teams have actually adopted Open API to design APIs because it's a little bit cumbersome, burdensome. Okay, all these, Early Days is the only one that fits our agreed upon definition of schema-driven, but they're only 50% there. And again, each of them have their own API journey, and none of them have reached their end goal. Okay, so the next question we asked, who's responsible for API first? So I was thinking like, I'm given this talk, I know what slides are coming, but in your mind, in your org, who is responsible for API first? It's a very broad, weirdly asked question anyways. But when I asked the 4 companies, Code First is decentralized. They have an architect for each business unit to set API standards, and they probably have multiple tens of business units. API Last has a dedicated enterprise architecture team. It's actually pretty small given their size, who builds all the internal tools for governance, sets the tests that need to pass for stuff to go to the next stage gate. Developer First also has a centralized task force, but they pull engineers from their day jobs to come together to do the governance and establish the rules. Early Days is also centralized, small team, but small overall headcount. They have API First and quality building the tools that are then leveraged across the other internal teams. And for all of them, almost all of them, rely on policy as code to programatize and automate usually custom rule sets and requiring tests to pass for the next stage gate. And almost all of them, except for Code First, have a dedicated team or role responsible for establishing the governance rules. It's an iterative process, so it's not just a one and done. Okay, so Developer First also has a unique process. Remember, they're the written design document circulator, and they list at the very beginning of their design document a checkbox or a gavel block to talk about any downstream impacted stakeholders. And they note their concerns thoroughly, and what's more important in this little testimonial here, I think, is that they document the trade-offs. It's equally important, what did you decide, how are you gonna do it, to what did you decide not to do and why. And so documenting what you didn't choose is equally important to the culture of Developer First. All right. You're gonna be disappointed by this next slide, but I think it's kind of important. What are your key API metrics? I feel like a lot of companies are early in their API First journey, and so figuring out what to measure is, again, an iterative process. Oh no, I feel really bad about picking that as an image, but API Last, very honestly said, we're not a metrics-driven company, and we don't have a lot of observability, so we actually don't even track API usage, but we do care about revenue. Okay? That's organizational culture driving that testimonial. Everyone else does track API usage, and then you have uptime, reliability, and performance, quality, and security. So not a ton to report on this slide, unfortunately, but again, it's an iterative process. All right. So I've already kind of shared some of the pain points, but what were the biggest pain points if you had to identify them? Okay, so this is Code First, the developer-led company, aka Prototype First. So remember, they're decentralized. Each business unit has an architect that establishes unique governance rules and API standards for the groups. That, no surprise here, it results in inconsistent developer experience, different SLAs. You can't really bundle together products because they're all apples and oranges, and it's tough for API discovery. You all work for the same company, but you don't really know what each other are producing. Okay, and then for API First, again, this is a key lesson here. They created a custom open API because they're special, because a lot of companies are special and you want to have your customizations. But this ended up meaning that they had to build their own custom tooling to support their specification. That takes longer. And then it also resulted in downstream quality issues. So it took longer and it was not as good of a product. For Early Days, I talked a little bit earlier about using open API is burdensome to engineers. And the engineering psyche is that when you're coming up with the API specifications and you're exploring all the different routes, all the different possibilities, that cognitive load can be a little bit overwhelming. And that's why you have 50% adoption in Early Days. And for Code First, that's why you have people just building a prototype first. And then with all of the companies, I didn't write it out separately for each of them, discovery was an issue. From the 1,000 headcount to the 30,000 headcount, how many APIs do we have? Can I take a look at your schema? Can I reuse some of your code? Discovery was an issue internally as well as externally, and then accountability, especially with centralized functions or roles. I'm the governance person, and I'm telling you, here's what we should be doing. Here's how you build high quality APIs, and here's how we should do it. But who is actually responsible for implementing API first? I've prescribed it. Who's responsible for doing it? Okay, so on the roadmap, what's next? So everyone is currently on their journey. Nobody is at their end goal. Code first, they're starting to think about APIs as a product. This is actually true for code first and API last. And so they're working on how do I increase adoption, find new segments. I have my APIs. Who else can be using my APIs? And then providing incremental functionality. So land and expand and new functionalities. API last, we talked about discovery being kind of difficult. So let's catalog our internal APIs so we know how many we have. I think they reached 100% compliance with Open API 4 years ago. At the time, they didn't know how many APIs they had. They still don't. I couldn't tell if that was a laugh, and I laughed and I clutched my pearls, and I was shocked at some of these answers. But these are companies that all of us look up to for business success, engineering success. These are just like you or me, and there's probably people that work at these companies in this room today. And they want to reduce development time. Remember, they have the custom open API. So it's taking a little bit longer than they want to. So let's get that down. Let's find that faster, saves time benefit of API first. Early Days also has an issue with cataloging APIs, and they also want to simplify the process. Right now, it is very burdensome for teams that want to push functionality live in the public APIs, and so simplifying that process. Okay. All right, so 4 lessons learned to smooth the way on your own API first journeys. This is a mistake if I drink this, right? My throat is so dry, but it's carbonated. Rookie mistake. Okay, first lesson learned. None of these are shocking, but there's a couple examples in here that hopefully really push it home. So organizational culture shapes your journey. Culture is so dang important. You know this when you work with humans. You know this when you interact in your regular everyday life. But in work life, this is so apparent. Again, I interviewed these companies thinking, okay, let's just find the commonalities. But everyone is so vastly different that it's pretty alarming. So one example is 2 of the companies, API last and developer first. They offer virtually identical products today. One started off selling B2C, one started off selling B2B, and then found success in their own areas, and then moved towards each other. But their approaches are hugely different. One understands the developer persona, and one's just now starting to think about APIs. So even the early roots shaping how their API first journey is going is eye-opening. Okay, so you can't have an API specifications talk without talking about Conway's Law. So this is super, code first really epitomizes Conway's Law. So Conway's Law is the adage that products end up mirroring your communication structure. And you can really tell from the outside looking in. So the code first organization, remember, they have decentralized governance. A single API architect sets the API standards for each business unit. They have a centralized function that handles all of their API docs. So the API docs look pretty uniform and consistent. But I talked about all those other inconsistencies before. Something's on the floor. Something got dropped. No one cares about API adoption or the API developer experience. Oh yeah. It's so apparent, I know everyone's in their minds trying to figure out who this is, but it's so apparent if you've ever worked with their APIs, Conway's Law. Okay, next lesson learned. Again, not rocket science, but Hugely important. Buy-in must come from all directions. This is bottoms up and tops down. And so remember, we have early days that has intellectual buy-in. They identify as API first, but they only have 50% adoption. In its early days, I say that just to give them a little bit of like way to save face, but they've been doing API first for years. So again, maybe they don't have the bottoms up buy-in. Top down, API last, we talked about VPs not really understanding the importance of APIs. And so you're not able to get approval for staffing, for restructuring, to be able to manage APIs as a product. And they're the ones that's not a metrics-driven org. Their words, not mine. So there's still no accountability for any kind of API adoption or API developer experience. Okay, so buy-in has to come from every direction, and it's gonna influence everyone's journey. Third lesson learned, ownership is driven by incentives. So only one team had a decentralized governance, and I read through some other materials, and I think the common consensus is decentralized governance doesn't really work. It works for this team theoretically, but this is that Conway's Law example. You have separate architects, you have a centralized documentation function, and nobody cares about API adoption or developer experience. So the flip side of that is centralized governance. With centralized governance, there's always the question, who's responsible for the implementation of API first? So the answer here, it really depends on the function that you're talking to. So we looked at the API producer lifecycle on the left earlier, and if you flatten out this cycle into a straight line, this is just a more detailed view of that same producer lifecycle. You can see that there's different owners at each stage of the producer lifecycle. And each owner has different objectives and incentives, and sometimes they're fundamentally at odds with another owner. So an architect or designer, looking in that second column right there, cares about an API specification because it's a contract to align all the stakeholders. And then further on down the line, you can get some more benefits. The developer, in the third column there, cares about how the contract helps them on the day-to-day to build faster and better. So this leads us to the very last lesson learned. I want to look in the crowd before I change the slide. Okay, good. Okay, so only outcomes matter. Why do API specifications even matter if outcomes aren't being achieved? So this is a tweet from the chief evangelist at Postman, Ken Lane, who is here today, somewhere around here. He says, okay, people, I'm moving forward under the assumption that very few people actually care about API specs. They only care about the outcomes they can enable. So can an API specification help you maintain consistency, generate tests and documentation, mock servers? Can you move faster? Can you move better? Can people be happier? And if people don't see these outcomes, or they don't believe that what they're doing will help them achieve those outcomes, then your API journey is doomed. Okay, so I do want to thank these 4 anonymous organizations, and I feel like I laughed a bit when I was writing these slides, and I heard some of you kind of like giggling. But even though we're kind of shocked by like how can these organizations be managing this way, I do want to reassure you that these are real companies, and in industry they are highly admired. So these are people that we look up to, and probably some of us here. So I thank them for sharing their raw, unfiltered truths. And then I've said, hopefully you caught this, but the API first is a smooth one. And I think a lot of the talks where I'm talking about the of API first, and here's how you get there. And a lot of that's great in theory, but in practice, not a journey. Am I cutting in and out? Yeah, sorry. I don't know, should I yell? Okay. So it's continuous, it's iterative, and nobody on our prosecution panel, nobody was at end game. Everyone is still constantly moving towards API first. So if you are interested in learning more, please stop by the Postman booth. Again, the conference is littered with Postmanauts. We have a bunch of other great talks that you can check out, and if you miss some of these talks, definitely stop by the booth and we'll get you situated with one of the speakers. All right, thank you. Yeah.
So it's impossible to have top down, bottom up. You can't do both. This is the only place to stop.
So the question, oh, am I still mic'd? No. Let me project. The question is, it's impossible and bottoms up. You gotta pick, oh,
Start that way.
to start with both support from both sides. So this is kind of a cheap answer, but I do believe that it's about your organizational culture. What works, these are working solutions for these four, these are operating solutions, let's call them, for these four folks, and it's working. And one started top down, one started bottoms up, and one is like, all of them are struggling for 100% support on both sides. I don't have an answer for that one. I will give a plug, so I'm gonna be writing a paper, a little bit more in-depth, juicy paper. So if somebody is at a company that wants to share some of their anonymized truths, please do find me, and I would love to hear a little bit more real details about the implementation side of things.